say that Larks Tongues in Aspic is better than the Crimson albums that precede it is not strictly true. It's the first record by what's perceived as the second generation lineup.
Got to remember that they'd made such an impact in the Court of the Crimson King, their debut album, and then went through an awful lot of personnel changes for the subsequent 3 records in the wake of Poseidon, Lizard and Islands. In fact, there was a constant flow of musicians in and out of the band, and I think that affected the whole cohesiveness of the unit.
There'd been some doubt whether Robert Fripp would continue with King Crimson after Pete Sinfield, his lyricist and partner in the band, had quit early in 1972. But during that summer he got a band together and took it in a more experimental direction than before.
It was Bill Bruford on drums, John Wetton on bass and vocals, a percussionist called Jamie Muir and a violinist called David Cross.
I was rehearsing with another group called Waves, and we asked EG Management, who were the managers and record company for King Crimson, to come down here and try to get a record deal with them. And they brought Robert Fripp, the guitarist, down to listen to us, and that's when I met him. And Robert at that time had just, I think, axed or broken up some version of King Crimson, and he wanted to do an album based on improvising in a kind of Indian music way. And he knew this percussionist called Jamie Muir. And so we were going to get together with him and do violin, guitar and percussion. So we went round to Jamie's house and we did some work on that. Didn't record anything, just tried some ideas out. That all seemed fun. And then a short time later, I got a call from Robert, and Robert suddenly decided he wanted to form King Crimson again. So he asked me to come along to a jam session with him, and so there were 5 of us, and we just improvised for the afternoon, and we all thought it sounded like fun, so that was it, and we were off.
The opening track of the album, Larks Tongues in Aspic Part 1, is a fine example of British art rock from the early 70s. You can't dance to it, you can't even tap your feet to it, and you can't really listen to it while you're doing the washing up either. You basically have to sit down between 2 speakers and let it come at you while you try and absorb it all and work out what it all means. This means you've got to be in the mood, really.
It's very free form, some very atmospheric percussion from Jamie Muir, and this sets the mood for the thing until gradually some interesting violin almost surreptitiously creeps in from David Cross. He's playing an A, an E and an F sharp, a kind of note formation that was very popular with the band at that time. They used to use a lot of diminished runs.
Sound like a fairly angry swarm of wasps against Fripp with his all his wizardry and his experimentation with guitars and guitar sounds and stuff.
The next part of the song develops with this unusual stamped violin part with diminished A's. This is essentially in 5/4. Crimson were very popular of time signatures like 5/4 and 7/4. This starts in 5/4, and then some screaming fuzz guitar comes in, it goes into 7. Then we have this wonderful wah-wah bass, which Wetton was so famed for. and it moves from 7 to 5/4 before it goes into some manic guitar playing and some very intricate drumming indeed from Bruford.
And it really takes off from there. The drums wind things up even more. They go up into sort of 4th gear by now. They're really cruising. There's other melodies sort of come crashing in, and the whole thing is very, very dark.
You get a good minute, a minute and a half perhaps, of pure improvisation, which sounds to me like they left space, they left that particular part of the canvas blank so that they could improvise. They all throw in a few licks, and it doesn't ever get self-indulgent. It's just long enough to be interesting and never too long.
What Larks Tongues did, it allowed the band to open up a little bit, go in various directions without feeling that there's having to try to contain themselves within the discipline of a pop song.
I mentioned about these diminished riffs that Bob Fripp likes to use, and even in Larks Tongues in Aspic, where the violin comes in, you find he plays this gentle underlying figure to the violin, which is actually incorporates yet again a diminished riff. In this instance, starts on a high D, an A and a D sharp, and he plays this kind of thing, which moves up, all the time moving up. And in actual fact, he plays this, I don't believe he uses a plectrum when he's doing this. He just lets the strings resonate and then up and up. So there is a typical Robert Fripp exercise, if you like. Loves his diminished runs.
King Crimson was something which, if you wanted to be rich and famous, it kind of wasn't the best band in town. On the other hand, you would have opportunities to experiment with a way of living your life and playing your instrument and working with others and playing music to people that presented opportunities you would not get if you worked by the book.
Fripp is a genius. That's all there is to be said.
One of the most interesting guitar players I think ever.
He could do the licks, but he could do more than that.
As a guitarist, Robert Fripp has no single style. He's a bit like the Alec Guinness of the guitar.
One of the most original ever to come out of Great Britain.
A musical visionary, a fantastic guitar player. You know, I mean, if you listen to Fripp, he led Crimson wherever the hell he wanted.
As one of the founder members and leaders of King Crimson, the band sort of followed his guitar style. He was the sort of main train of the music in many ways.
He can range from classical to soft jazz to heavy metal.
I'd say that Robert Fripp is a master, a craftsman. Is he a genius? That's such an emotive term to put in anybody, and I think it's unfair to call him a genius because I don't think he's necessarily as abnormal as any self-respecting genius should be.
You know that's Robert Fripp usually straight away as well. He's always produced a very thick, creamy electric guitar sound. And whilst it was obviously had overdriven distortion elements to it, it was not as distorted, say, a guitar sound as, say, Page or Hendrix. It was closer to someone like Jeff Beck, but without being anywhere near as bluesy. I mean, basically, I think Robert Fripp didn't come from the blues. I think there's much more kind of Western European music, including classical and jazz music forms, that had sort of informed him.
You know, his beginning for Larks Tongues Part 1, I mean, that's a very kind of violinist. All that sort of stuff. I mean, that's a really nice use of you know, of double stops in violin. He understood that and realised that that's, you know, what a violin could sound like. You know, but other ideas. I remember he wrote a jig once which didn't seem to. I couldn't get to work at all. You know, I just didn't seem to sit well with me.
He's a clever musician, Fripp. He allows other musicians to shine and isn't scared to take a back seat while they are shining.
Which I think really shows his ability, because he had so much confidence in himself and in what he could do that he was not afraid to say to someone like John Wetton, I'll tell you what, I'd like this track to really lead off with your bass. I'll follow what you do. Because he knew he could do it and bring out and complement the music. And that's the other thing about Fripp, not just a virtuoso guitarist, but a musician who thought about what was best for the band.
My feeling being in the band was that it was actually very egalitarian, it was very, very even, and in terms of equal opportunities, the opportunities were there for everybody.
It was more a functioning anarchism, not an anarchy where you have no ruler and it's a mess, but an anarchism where there is no ruler, that each of the characters involved accept responsibility for themselves. So it's a far more interesting experiment, far more difficult, but potentially more alive.
I think he had more of a vision of what it might be we were doing than maybe we did. So I think his kind of, if he had the last word, I think probably deserved it.
Bill Bruford on drums had come from Yes, and John Wetton on bass had come from Family. But the others had no real band experience at all. The seemingly diverse lineup of the band actually worked because Wetton and Bruford anchored the rhythm section of the music, leaving Robert Fripp, David Cross on violin and James Muir on percussion to float around on top.
What I like most about Bruford and Wetton as a rhythm section is Wetton's quite straightforward, quite a sort of classic rock player, whereas Bruford had all the agility of a jazz drummer, but the mindset of a sort of fusion, progressive rock musician. So it's beautiful to hear Bill Bruford in full flow, playing some fairly complex polyrhythmic drum parts, and Wetton would provide the sort of classic rock backdrop of a sort of big, heavy, chunky bass, and let Bruford shine, and vice versa. When Wetton was taking off playing bass, Bruford would take things down to almost hardly anything, just a hi-hat or just a bass drum, say, and allow Wetton to sort of shine through as well.
King Crimson was not a strange destination for Bill Bruford because he's the kind of drummer that thrives on a challenge. And my God, if there was one thing joining King Crimson gave you, it was a challenge.
I mean, he came in very much as the kind of, at the time, certainly the rock drummer, you know, not just prog rock. I mean, he was the rock drummer, and he was very, very good, I think.
Bill Bruford had quit Yes just as they'd reached their musical, though not their commercial, peak, as they were tipping over the progressive edge into pomposity. King Crimson for him was the perfect antidote. It was all about art, music and self-expression, and not about egomania.
What King Crimson allowed was Bill Bruford to explore other territories. He's a tremendous percussionist in his own right, a great jazz drummer, and he got the opportunity with King Crimson to explore and to open up, to push the parameters a little bit, whereas he didn't really get that with Yes.
Bill Bruford's jazzy leanings and his combination of dexterity and rock power made him a special drummer. But what really marked him out was his ability to be able to enhance the melodies that were going on around him.
Some of the rhythms that came out really, I had to sit down. I mean, he would write things out on notation on paper, and I'd spend hours sort of trying to fathom out what the hell he was doing.
If one thinks of other classic rock bands, they used to go for a much more open, ambient drum sound, and the King Crimson drum sound was almost jazz.
It was clear he'd listened to all the jazz greats on drums and taken on board their technique and their approach, but he'd combined that very cleverly with, I guess you would call it progressive rock meets experimental rock.
To play with, yeah, I mean, I don't know, it was just so tight and so on the ball. At times it was intimidating because, you were frightened to play anything in case it wasn't, in case it was in the wrong place. And it would sound very obviously in the wrong place because he was so much in the right place. And at other times it was very secure.
John Wetton's bass playing brought a sense of power to the funkiness of the band. He was also reliable and versatile, which was important given the improvisational nature of so much that was going on around him.
If we were in a situation where everything was up for grabs, he would tend to kind of make things calm down, focus on one or two notes, just keep some kind of idea of where do is, where the key is, what we're doing. But that was his job, really. That's part that goes with the instrument.
He had all sorts of different abilities as a musician. He could be a funky bass player, he could be a pensive bass player, he could be simplistic when it was required and economical, and he could be quite flash technically. And it was great. It worked perfectly with Bill Bruford playing drums in this lineup.
His musical intellect was, tremendous. I mean, he was able to cope with all these weird, 13/8s and weird time signatures. He was able to lock in with Bruford playing these very complex patterns. His use of scales, his instinctive understanding of harmony and everything was all, excellent. So the kind of his musical credentials were certainly all there.
He became a lead performer in the King Crimson lineup because it allowed him to be a virtuoso, whereas beforehand with the likes of Family and subsequently with Uriah Heep, he had to fit into a structure, into a format which was designed by others. I think Robert Fripp allowed him to be what he could be, which is a brilliant musician.
He was pivotal and key. I mean, he was he was taking on the role of the vocals. He was taking on the role of the #1 communicator. Fripp, for all his desire to be, a rock hero or whatever prompted him to go on stage in the first place, still didn't like being lit. Always wore black, never had any lights on him, and I believe he's still doing similar things now. So somebody had to make some effort to communicate with the audience, and John was the only person, with the experience.
In all honesty, John Wetton doesn't really compare with the original King Crimson vocalist Greg Lake, although he's certainly better than any of those that came in between.
I must confess to having mixed feelings about this. I always preferred his bass playing to his singing, to be perfectly honest, and one has to remember that the Larks Tongues album was his first delving into being a lead vocalist. He'd been a backup singer before there, and I think it took him one album to get into his stride.
We lay cards upon the table, the backs of our hands, and I swear I like your people, the boys in the band. Reminiscence has gone astray, coming back to enjoy the fray in a tangle of night and daylight sound.
John Wetton was a vocalist who probably could do what Lake couldn't later on, in that he fitted complex modes and moods into the music with the way he enunciated his vocals. It was almost as if his vocals were another instrument rather than just singing.
John had quite a nice soul style to his voice, and a bit of rock and a bit of soul in there, which sort of was great against some of the sort of musical ideas that were going on, and it probably made some of the pieces of music more accessible to some listeners by his voice having that emotion in it.
Occasionally I think his voice would tend slightly towards sort of pomposity and slightly towards a kind of sort of an intellectualized version of a song, and that didn't turn me on so much.
Certainly he's a different kind of rock vocalist from, say, the Paul Rodgers or somebody like that. But then again, someone like Paul Rodgers would have been totally inappropriate for King Crimson. I think it was an archetypal prog rock vocal style that he had, and it worked.
There's the sucker of the needy, incredible scenes. I'll believe you in the future, your life and your dreams. As the cavalry of despair takes a stand in the lady's hair for the favor of making sweet 16.
The song Book of Saturday on the Larks Tongues and Aspic album was quite an intimate track, and it was Robert Fripp actually showing off some of his classical guitar style playing, I think, a little bit of that. And it was more pensive King Crimson, and really quite nice. It was a good little track, and sort of he gave a release from some of the more sort of frenetic and sort of angrier pieces of music that they had surrounding that particular track.
It is a kind of strange bedfellow. It is a bit odd having kind of nicely crafted songs alongside rather, modern and strange instrumental pieces, because I think the audiences tend to be different, and I think that so people who like songs are not going to like nasty instrumental pieces, and people who like those modernist pieces are not going to like pretty songs. But I like both of those things, and I'm sure that all of us did in Crimson in those days. So you have to do what you like, don't you, really?
Completeness in the morning, asleep on your side. I'll be waking up the crewman, banana boat ride. She responds like a limousine, brought alive on a silent screen through the shuddering breath of yesterday. There's a sucker of the needy, incredible.
The lyrics are by Pete Sinfield, who was still an occasional collaborator, and John Wetton sings them pretty well, although his voice is a bit strained when he has to tackle some of the longer notes.
It's a strange one. I think it's basically it's a love song. It's a strange, bittersweet love song. I think it's probably at the time, Robert Fripp, even though for all his improvisational and experimental qualities, I think he's a bit of a romantic deep down.
You listen to Book of Saturday and it's a little bit unsatisfying because it is a very well structured, short song. To call it a pop song is a little unfair. It's not a pop song in a way that people would understand pop these days. What I mean by that is it was a very well structured verse-chorus song to some extent, which didn't really showcase the band at their best. They were in their finest mode when they really opened up and allowed the song to breathe rather than suddenly stopping and saying, well, that's the end of it.
It's a concise ballad, and there's some interesting embellishments on it, not least the backwards guitar or violin. It's kind of hard to tell which, actually.
It's a piece of low art, isn't it, compared with the high art of Larks Tongues Part 1, if that can qualifies as high art.
If you were to say one track that probably identifies them, this could be as good as any.
Easy Money is a loud, edgy number.
What stands out most is the sort of pyrotechnical percussive intro. That's Bruford. That's where you see what Bill Bruford brought to sort of King Crimson.
It starts in 65 beats per minute in E minor with this lovely slow fours plod, and goes through all of the expected time signature changes from 4 to 7, which you would expect. And some great guitar work. It goes from extremely heavy through to slinky and quiet. I think there's everything on there for the Crimson fan.
When it's set amongst the other tracks on that album, it works very well, but it's quite unexpected. But yet again, of course, that's typical of King Crimson, to have a track that's completely unexpected.
Easy Money, rather like Book of Saturday, was very much a well-structured, shortish song. And the problem with those sort of things at the time, certainly in Larks Tongues in Aspic era, was that it really didn't allow the band to be what they could be. And they always found the constraint, it seemed a little bit like being in a straitjacket.
Very experimental album. A lot of very clever improvisation on the first part of the title track, and on the talking drum, some wonderful improvisation.
We used to do a lot of improvisation and then kind of crystallise that into more formal compositions then. But increasingly what we did as time went on was just improvise, and then record the improvisations, maybe use those as the basis of an album.
But King Crimson music was generally player specific. It wasn't written for anyone to play. It was written by those people, for those people, with those people in mind.
They seemed to be able to, when they were doing improvisational tracks in the studio, know their place. In other words, they weren't playing all the time, because when you get lots of people improvising together, it can be a mess. But they had the ability to lay out at the right moment in the correct musical places and let other people take over for that 16-bar sequence or whatever it was. So I think they all listened to each other when they were playing.
For me, Larks Tongues in Aspic did define the new era of King Crimson, and I think it was the most important album since In the Court of the Crimson King. But it would be a brave man that would say that it was actually a better album than In the Court of the Crimson King.
Court of the Crimson King, when it came out, nobody had heard anything like that before. So when you first heard that album, it was astonishing what they were doing. So by the time you actually get to Larks Tongue, you sort of know what they're up to. So in many ways, although it's a great record, I think it's on a par with the ones that followed Court of the Crimson King.
They found a real cohesiveness on the record, which makes it certainly the best album that King Crimson had done since In the Court of the Crimson King. But also it was the beginning of a step forward, which was to take them through Starless and Bible Black and into Red.
Jamie Muir, as a percussionist and all sorts, as it says on the back of one of the CDs, brought all sorts of things to the band.
I think he was a really nice addition to the band. It had all been a little bit got a little bit highbrow and a bit intellectualised, and I think he sort of brought it down to brought the sort of earthy kind of humour more to the band.
Jamie Muir was regarded by some as King Crimson's secret weapon.
He could play, it seemed, anything and everything and incorporate it into the sound of the band.
Normally you'd get a percussionist just playing congas, shakers, that sort of thing. He was much wider based than that.
It wasn't just hitting things randomly. There seemed to be an innate sense of what worked and what didn't. And because he was a percussionist who actually could bring in random sounds but make them cohesive, he gave that band a certain sense of freeform, a certain sense of adventure that couldn't possibly just be brought into play by a drum kit.
There were mirrors, there were metal plates, cowbells, arm bells, double-handed saws, and a bowl of pistachio nutshells.
Just had wonderful talent for using junk to make music. He had saucepans all over his drums were made of saucepans and kitchen utensils, and it just looked like his house. I mean, just was chaos. It was wonderful. It was sort of beautifully organised chaos. he also was very aware of being a performer on stage. So he used to dress up in a bear skin and be very, very extrovert. He used to use blood capsules and things at a time and in a context when sometimes people were thinking we ought to be playing in sort of concert halls and all that sort of stuff, and he'd be have blood pouring out of his mouth and feigning heart attacks on stage and things like that.
If you listen to tracks like Talking Drum and Easy Money and Larks Tongues Part 1, absolutely inventive and off-the-wall percussionist, certainly not of the norm.
Very melodic percussionist, and almost quite a gentle percussionist. So he would have worked very well with Bruford, who would have been allowed to play the bombastic hand.
I think he opened doors. I think it made it possible for me to do stranger things than I otherwise would have been able to do, because we were able to transcend styles, so anything became possible rather than being too boxed in. He was only there for sort of the beginning and the first album, but his kind of his flavour, I think, carried right the way through.
David Cross, who played mainly violin and a bit of keyboards, I think was excellent choice for someone to come into the band, because his violin playing was great. It could be avant-garde, it could be romantic, it could be slightly classical, it could sometimes be a little jazzy. So that was it was another voice, an improvisational voice within the music of King Crimson.
What I think he understood very well was that Robert Fripp, even though he was a rock guitarist, he was also very much a sort of thinking man's guitarist. I think he would think about everything he was going to play first. I think David Cross read this very well and knew when to get out of the way of Fripp's guitars, and he would just maybe still be playing, but he'd be playing just a couple of very long notes as a backdrop to showcase Fripp's guitars.
When everybody's playing, you probably wouldn't hear me. I mean, when everybody's going, Robert's doing things, you're not going to hear me going. I mean, I may be there, but if the guitar's, if he's doing it on guitar, with this kind of. If all that's going on, you're not going to hear the violin as it was then, above that sort of sound, so you probably wouldn't notice when I'm playing loud bits. What I brought to it was quite a good understanding of complex music, good understanding of kind of modernism, of what was happening in modern music. I understood about East European music, I had a good feel for East European music, Bartok, that kind of thing. So, I mean, when I would come in, I would count rhythms, going 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, which is all kind of, a Bartokian way of approaching things. And I didn't really understand syncopation at all, which is kind of very basic to rock music. I didn't really understand about the sounds, about how important the sounds were. I didn't understand about the kind of the hero in rock music, the guitar hero and all this sort of stuff. I thought music was a kind of cooperative venture where you work very hard with each other to kind of pull it off together, and that you just listen very carefully to each other. But the notion of doing a show and being a star and all that, which is very, very tied into rock music, was all a bit of a shock to me, really. I was really quite naive about all that.
Is Starless and Bible Black a great album? I actually love it, even though we'd lost that great character Jamie Muir by now.
What Starless and Bible Black did was allow the members still there to suddenly feel, oh, we're getting to know each other a little bit. There's a sense of cohesion here. There's a sense of actually having stability in this band. And Starless and Bible Black really did rise to the occasion.
There was a kind of midway point, I suppose, between the kind of openness and maybe too diverse palette of Larks Tongues and, you know, the maybe too condensed palette of Red, that somewhere in between was this sort of version of the band where things were a lot tighter, you know, where the focus was a lot tighter and we didn't waste so many notes, maybe, you know, said things in a rather more succinct way than we had done on Larks Tongues. But at the same time, it hadn't been sort of completely pushed into the whole kind of, you know, straight ahead rock area.
Great to see her. Cigarettes, ice cream, figurines of the Virgin Mary. Cigarettes, ice cream, figurines of the Virgin Mary.
The Great Deceiver is a great opening track. It's not too long, it leaves you wanting more. It's a perfect opener for that album.
Classic King Crimson mode, sort of very, very tight, clever riffing, the guitar and bass playing the same riff, very, very clever riff at quite a fast speed, the drums following, and it's sort of kind of jazzy, rocky, fusiony elements, but still got that kind of rock, progressive rock thing overriding it, so it doesn't sort of turn into sort of self-indulgent sort of musicians' sort of delight sort of thing.
To this day, I can't play it with my foot going down on the right place. I always had to play it on the offbeat. It was always very strange. It goes and I always had it and so the counting, my foot would always have to go down half a beat after everybody else's. So I always remember that. It always seemed very bizarre. And then I'd have to change a half beat halfway through. I just could not hear it because when you hear something wrong the first time, I just could not get out of that. So whenever I played it, I used to stagger through it, playing it kind of half a beat at a time with everybody else.
I think the first 5 tracks, which tend to sound more composed and less improvised, certainly to me, I think they're the ones that work better.
There's some great tracks that Will Let You Know, which is a great track, a great piece of sort of improvised rock, funk, I'd call it. John Wetton is really allowed to sparkle on this and shine as a bass player. Bruford plays very, very simply and very groovy, and it's excellent. Again, they were breaking new ground. You know, they'd never really sort of had such a powerful bass player in the band. So it's nice to hear that coming through.
John Wetton appears to come of age in the band. His singing is vastly superior to that on the Larks Tongues album. His bass playing seems to be more to the fore.
People stomped on dirty floors before I trod the rock and roll stage.
The second side of the album features 2 instrumental tracks that were recorded live and then had the audience sound taken out and a couple of overdubs added. The second, Fracture, features Fripp at his fiendish best, really. It's a jazz rock meets heavy metal meets alternative progressive.
It's dark, magnificent, it's got fusion, it's got jazz in it, it's got improvisational techniques in it, it's got great guitar playing.
All of the classic time signature changes are there, some great guitar work, as ever, those ever faithful diminished runs from Robert Fripp. They are my least favourite tracks, funnily enough. I like the intricacies and the more, what seems more worked outness, if you like, of the earlier tracks.
It's great. It's kind of intellectual rock. This is they've sort of very confidently pushed out of progressive rock, and I think they're stating, listen, you know, we're the only band in the world that have these sort of kind of capabilities and musicianship to play such ambitious stuff but keeping it within the kind of rock fans' dream. And I think they pull it off really successfully.
I think its only weakness for me was for a newcomer to King Crimson, a new listener, it's not necessarily particularly accessible straight away. And that would be its only weakness, I feel.
I wonder what on earth Crimson fans must have made of it at the time. It's almost sort of avant-garde heavy metal, you know, that possibly weren't that easy to listen to.
To some earlier die-hard King Crimson fans, it might be a bit too clever, or maybe going into the field of fusion music a bit too much. But this is probably one of the underrated King Crimson albums from that period. It's an excellent record.
That riff is a thing that stays with you. The opening riff is something that you can't forget.
The title track of the Red album is fiery, dissonant heavy metal with a crunching guitar from Robert Fripp and pounding bass from John Wetton. Maybe it goes on a bit, but they certainly ride the riff for all it's worth, and anybody who enjoys the early King Crimson will certainly get off on this track.
It's very guitar oriented, with that lovely riff that works around a suspended B flat to an A flat with an E root, and then it moves up a tone. A lot of people think this is the greatest ever Crimson riff, and they certainly had hundreds, but this is right up there.
Typical Robert Fripp again, you know, starting with sort of really quite powerful and quite heavy type guitar and sort of frenetic and frantic phrases, and you know, a bit like sort of explosive, and then it all coming together again.
And it's so heavy, it really knocks you back, because it was heavier really than anything Black Sabbath were doing, or that Deep Purple had done. And that's what people don't realise. People talk about progressive rock, they talk about jazz influences, talk about classical influences. You listen to Red, the title track of that album by King Crimson, and you're hearing a very heavy band indeed, who could stand up to anything called heavy rock or heavy metal at the time.
I mean, it's weird because it's the album that was made when they really were falling to pieces. You know, I think they might have gone out on the road, but they were down to a trio. You know, Bruford, Fripp, and Wetton, and yet in the face of seeming adversity, you know, they pulled out a real corker of a record.
I think parts of it are the best work that they've ever done. Certainly the track Providence, with that great fuzz bass solo from John Wetton, is a particular favourite. Interestingly, David Cross was no longer with the band, although he appears on it and he guests, and on the track Providence his influence is very strongly felt.
if you listen to Providence, you'll find that we're playing, although the key centre may be agreed, we're actually playing quite different scales and got quite different attitudes to what's going on, but it locks together. Now that can only work with confidence. It only works when you know it's going to work. I've been with other people in similar situations, and as soon as you start playing something that's not in the same scale they're playing, or as soon as your one happens to be somebody else's place, they stop playing and said, oh, it's gone wrong. Whereas the going wrong was what made King Crimson improvisations exciting and interesting and sometimes beautiful.
Red is probably King Crimson's heaviest album. It's heavy metal with jazz, funk and even classical thrown in as well. It doesn't have the highlights of Larks Tongues in Aspic or Starless and Bible Black, but as an album it's somehow more complete.
No, this was a lineup that made some of the heaviest music that King Crimson had made up to that point, and yet Fripp would be throwing in these sort of like little guitar passages that were almost like blending pop music and jazz, at the same time. So it's just, there was so much going on.
Red really rose to the occasion. It's a great record. Apart from In the Court of the Crimson King, their debut, I'd say this is the best album King Crimson made, and it's also the album that has become possibly the most important in their history because it inspired so much of what happened later on. You listen to Red and you can hear the birth of grunge. You listen to Red and you can hear the birth of what people call progressive music these days. It really is that important. And we're talking about 1974 here, more than 30 years ago. But this is one of these seminal albums, not just of its period, but of any period of progressive rock.
Because it's essentially a three-piece as well with additional musicians, sometimes it sounds a bit angry. In some ways that works, but it doesn't have some of the spaciness and some of the sort of plaintiveness of some of the other records.
You might have thought that having slimmed down to a trio to record Red, Crimson wouldn't be as effective, and yet to my mind they created some of the best music. Maybe just not having people there that weren't working out or didn't want to be there allowed them more creative freedom, but there's a wonderful looseness to the music on Red.
The fact now that they were down to three meant that they possibly each contributed more to the overall feel of each track.
You have three master musicians who really did complement each other. It was a three-piece. And a power trio in so many respects, but a power trio who could also explore, open up, as you saw on the Starless track, which was the closing of the album. This is one of the greatest pieces of music of the period, and you listen to it now and you think, good grief, it's so well structured, so well disciplined, but it really has so much inspiration about it as well.
Beautiful line in Starless. It's a beautiful little melodic line which comes in that even now it makes me ache. I would love to play that piece of music again. Love to.
It's, for my mind, possibly better than In the Court of the Crimson King, which might sound sacrilegious to some King Crimson fans. But then bear in mind, sonically, it's not 100 miles away from the sound of In the Court of the Crimson King either.
Starless starts gently, poignantly even, with a mournful mellotron, and that feeling is echoed by John Wetton's vocals.
his vocal delivery is just fantastic and suits the music so well. It just seems very at ease with itself until, of course, it explodes later on down the line.
It's almost as if, right, we started off with this song and we're going to present you with the lyrics, present you with the theme, and then suddenly, bang, phase 2 opens up and it becomes very, very heavy.
It suddenly breaks into an intense instrumental howl of anger.
You know, it's almost as if it's like, right, that's enough of the melodic stuff, let's lob a few avant-garde curveballs in there and you know, and then get as noisy as we want to be, sort of thing. But yeah, it sets such a wonderful mood, I think.
You can appreciate almost Alice in Chains or Pearl Jam doing something along those lines, because it really does you hear the musicians playing off each other and really just going for it big time. And then suddenly part 3 happens where it becomes a little more jazzy, a little more freeform, a little more classical jazz in a way. And you actually hear the musicians saying, right, okay, let's see what we can do. Let's see where we can go. Let's see where we can explore, albeit still within very much an understanding of each other. And then finally, it ends by the recurring theme from the original part of the track coming back in, which is almost like it's a conclusion, it's a full stop, we finished. Okay, go away and enjoy it. It's a wonderful piece of music.
It's the centrepiece of the album, and for my money, it's the finest piece of music that King Crimson, certainly with Fripp and Bruford in the band as well, ever made.
In some ways, Starless brings King Crimson full circle, from the awesome power of their first album, In the Court of the Crimson King, to the apocalyptic fury of their last. In fact, after Starless, it was difficult to see where else King Crimson could go.
By this time, the band were capable of absolutely great things. And it's very interesting that Bob Fripp decided this was to be it, this was to be no more, because I think it was good to leave the fans wanting more.
Bill Bruford and John Wetton believed that the band could make a Pink Floyd-style breakthrough at this point. But unfortunately, Robert Fripp was becoming somewhat mentally frazzled. He'd found that the effort of playing intense avant-garde music and improvising every night to an audience who pretty much just wanted to boogie was proving a bit much for him.
The big strength of the Fripp, Bruford, Wetton lineup, and you know, whenever Cross and Muir were also in the band, was that they were probably the most experimental lineup. Yeah, and they weren't afraid to sort of flex their muscles.
Larks Tongues Part 1, Fracture, The Mincer, Starless and Bible Black. The list is endless of great examples of perfect progressive rock improvisation. They were powerful players, all of them, and I think that it would have been wrong not to have left room for them to improvise.
I think one of the things that people sometimes don't realise about improvisation is how much you have to work at it. That it's, you know, you rehearse improvisation, you work at it, you try it out, you try things out. You'll do things in rehearsal that you wouldn't do on stage in order to get the skill to do it, and then you suddenly do things on stage that you've never done before because the occasion's lifted you. But it requires that kind of concentration that all music has. It's not just it's getting up and playing around.
by now, it kind of depends where you stand with King Crimson as to whether you feel they were overrated or underrated. Once they'd reduced to a trio, in some ways they became more conventional, which pleased fans of the older style of music. But those who'd followed them in their avant-garde direction probably thought they were going a bit soft.
It's difficult to say whether the Fripp, Bruford, Wetton lineup is underrated, but it is certainly true to say that if you mention King Crimson, most people will immediately go Robert Fripp, Greg Lake in the Court of the Crimson King. And that's where, that's the starting point.
It's difficult to compare and contrast those two lineups, even though they're only 5 years apart. Many albums down the line have happened. I would say, in terms of influence, the lineup on Red is the most important in King Crimson's history. I would say, in terms of importance to the way music opened up, to the way music developed, it is certainly that way as well. Personally, I'd say it's on a level par with the first lineup. It's very difficult to differentiate between the two of them.
Yeah, they were hugely underrated. I think the most important thing is there was a unique band in the history of music, and they were British.
There's no doubt about it. Yet King Crimson, through all their incarnations, right up to and including Red, were a massively important band who made a major mark on history and never sat on their laurels, hence the constant lineup shift, hence the constant look for changes in direction. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. It worked brilliantly on Red and it worked superbly on the first album. What came in between was a band who had to go through a lot of those changes to make their impact with Red.
It's a mistake to say that King Crimson was my band. I was one of the players. I might have had a certain vision of something for the band. I mean, there would be remarkable experiences in the band. It was as if music leant over and took us into its confidence.